time again. It's episode 3 of the Default Podcast. My name's Keir, and once again, joined by my good friend, Mr. Kieran Masterton. Hey, Kieran.
Good morning, Keir. How are you?
I'm very well, very well. How are you today?
I'm very well as well. It's a dreary day in Bradford-on-Avon.
Straight to the weather. And how's your health? How was the chest-space malady since the last episode?
I'm fine. It's all cleared away, and I'm fit as a fiddle.
Fit as a fiddle. Fit as a butcher's dog, or
But thank
whatever.
you for asking.
Well, it's a pleasure, always. Things are progressing on the subscriber front. I think we're tipping 50 on the YouTube channel. I think it's close.
It is, yeah. Just a few more subscriptions, and we'll be able to have our vanity URL.
Which is really what we're doing this for.
I mean, it is what I'm doing this for. I'm sitting here producing video so that I can have /default HQ.
Exactly. And maybe you can afford another black cap at some point from the ad revenue that we will undoubtedly generate from our YouTube audience.
I'm not sure that a man needs more than 25 black caps, do they?
Is it only 25? It seems more. Maybe it's
I retire them after a time.
Exactly that. But since the last episode, you have released a quickfire, a shortened video format, all about the Ajax API.
I have done, yes, yeah. It was a really quick video because, to be honest, it's a very small change, but it's a change that has a big impact. Nothing's breaking, so it's not a breaking change. You don't have to rush and update your themes or your apps or anything. But it's it's a change to the Ajax API that allows you to add multiple items to the cart at once, which I would say that to use Shopify parlance has been an epic want from partners for a long time.
Exactly. So fundamentally, previously to this, you had to just do multiple calls to the Ajax API to add multiple items.
So it was a bit clumsy, to be honest. It was, I think quite a lot of partners just wrote a little piece of stock JavaScript that they use as a queue. So you would, say you're adding a bundle to the cart, you'd add, 5 items, one after the other, and you have to queue and wait for one request to come back and then do the next one. And it was just a little bit clumsy, and that still works. And you could still have that fallback for if there was an error, for example. So error handling still a bit interesting. Error handling, basically, if you send 9 items to the cart to be added, it will not add any of those items if one of them is out of stock.
Okay.
And then you have to do a little bit of work to understand which item was out of stock. It gives you the name of the item that was out of stock, but that isn't that useful in a programmatic sense, is it? The variant ID would be more useful, but it's a big step forward nevertheless.
So what, do you just simply pass an array now as opposed to a single?
Yeah, it's simple as that. So you can still just pass a single variant ID if you want to, and a quantity, but you can now also have the option to pass an array and have all the items added at once.
Great. Well, if you would like to learn more about that, there's a little demo in your video on the Default HQ YouTube channel, which you can get to by defaulthq.com/video. This is quite a bit of news and sort of important things that have emerged from Shopify in the last couple of weeks.
Shopify releasing all the things.
Yeah, the first one that caught my eye was the official deprecation or end of life for Slate, which I noticed someone was talking about recently. For those that don't know, Slate was, I don't know how you describe it, a framework for building themes, a somewhat opinionated, in my opinion, approach to building themes that for some time Shopify was pushing as the sort of the go-to way to build themes, as a sort of and I think they backed this as the way that they wanted partners and developers to build themes. But they've official end of support January 2020. Any thoughts to why maybe it didn't take off, Kieran? What are your thoughts on this?
I think there's 2 separate things here. The first thing is, why did it take off? I think perhaps ThemeKit was its ancestor. So ThemeKit was the thing that came before Slate, and I think a lot of devs liked ThemeKit and used it quite regularly. But I think ThemeKit was a step too far into the direction of opinionation, if that's a word.
Do you mean Slate was, not ThemeKit?
Sorry, Slate. Yeah. So Slate was a little bit too opinionated for most developers. Most agencies and theme developers have, technologies they like to work with, front-end technologies, preprocessors, all that stuff. and Slate was pretty opinionated about what you should use and how you should use it and how it should work. It also didn't fit into everyone's workflows in terms of things like multi-store, multi-environment, that kind of thing. We're a little bit clumsy on it. So yeah, it's and then the other piece of it is kind of why it's being deprecated. And it was kind of put into a maintenance mode about 6 months ago, or maybe a bit more, maybe 12 months ago.
Yeah, that rings a bell. That's familiar.
Yeah, and that maintenance mode sort of came around at the same time as the command line tool was being rolled out by Shopify.
Okay.
Which is very, very much more app focused. So not a replacement, and not even related really in terms of how they function. If anything, the command line tool was a replacement for what was called developer tools, which was a Mac app. I don't know if you remember that.
Yes. Yeah.
Which was quite a well regarded Mac app, I think, and did things like sort of dummy data creation and stuff like that. And it's certainly what I still use to this day to create dummy data on test stores.
Yeah.
Though it is a little buggy now on Catalina. But anyway, so that was the kind of time period this happened, and it was put into maintenance mode, and there was quite a lot of whispering on the partner Slack about is this the end of Slate? And then I think some people at Shopify said, this isn't the end of Slate. We're sort of reconsidering where we're going with this. We put it into maintenance mode while we work on other projects. And then it was either this week or last week that they came out and said that it was officially end of life. And I think that's probably motivated by Sections Everywhere and the work involved in. I probably shouldn't call it Sections Everywhere. They're calling it something else, aren't they? What's the
section theme architecture?
Theme architecture, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
In the document.
So the thing, the artist formerly known as Sections Everywhere, has presented probably quite a big development challenge in terms of how do we retrofit this to Slate.
Yes, exactly.
And so they're thinking, well, let's just reimagine the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I remember seeing Slate for the first time when it was being developed when I was at Shopify, and was like hugely impressed and thought it would be a massive win in many ways. But when it finally saw the light of day, and digging into it, it was, as you say, very opinionated. And I think people who are maybe using which is no bad thing. We all use opinionated software tools on a daily basis, and I think that's
certainly Shopify does, right? Like, much more opinionated than Rails.
Yeah, and I think it takes a lot of that decision making that you out of the equation, which oftentimes is great. Okay, this convention, over configuration, etc., etc. Let's go with it and just buy into it. But I think a lot of the bigger agencies that would have benefited from this had already got their own processes, in place, their own sort of development pipelines and deployment pipelines and all of that kind of thing. And to actually take a very functioning store and retrofit it to Slate, which maybe wasn't the steer that Shopify gave, by absolutely not saying they did, but to benefit from all the goodness in Slate would have been a massive piece of work. So I think maybe adoption wasn't as as full on as they'd hoped. But I think ThemeKit, I always love ThemeKit. It did 2 or 3 things exceedingly well.
Yes,
and it was very easy to plumb in like pre-processors to it, and you could set a delay with the synchronization and all those things. And then you could also use things like live reload, and you'd put in your sort of proxy to the store and stuff, your dev store, and it would all kind of work. So that's kind of how when I was playing around, used to work. Not saying it's necessarily the best way. I wasn't using this day in day out like some, but it's a shame. But I think as long as there are some tools out there, I think ThemeKit's still being supported. Let me just see if we can find any details on that. The last commit to ThemeKit was 16 hours ago as we speak. So I think all being well, that will still function and give people that opportunity to develop against that live development store in the cloud, as it were. So interesting.
And we should say that I think Slate was built on top of ThemeKit originally, right? So ThemeKit is still the underpinnings.
Right. Yeah, it does all the synchronization and sort of pushing, pulling, diffs, etc. But in better news, the dev docs, I should say, has got a facelift, and
it has, and a new domain,
Shopify.dev, which is interesting. Few highlights there. There's a few things that have seen the light of day that people might not have been aware of if you click under the Docs menu, there's some new areas of interest, including Data Warehouse API, the Ping API, and the Hosted Payment SDK. So if those are new terms to you, you may want to go and check those out. Any other things that caught your attention, Kieran?
Yeah, I think I should say those things I think are still sort of limited availability at Shopify in terms of like what account you have and what relationship you have in terms of the hosted payment SDK. But it does
added
seem that
extras.
very much added extras or dependent on historic access and stuff. But I think that the fact that they're now surfaced in the developer docs is really good, because these things were always quite difficult to track down in the past. I have to say, I know this is maybe a bit of a boring comment, but from a user experience point of view, it's really nice. I think the developer docs got to a point where they were growing at such a rate, and I know personally, having contributed to it in various areas, like that we were struggling to know where to put various guides and things. They got this really nice section called concepts, which is basically what they've taken the guides from. So I can go to concepts, and I can jump down to say ways to build, and then I can jump into themes from there, for example, or I can look at using the Shopify APIs, and then I've got a whole guide, multi-page guide on versioning. And you can sort of jump around the different sections on versioning. So I can go specifically to versioning and specifically to webhooks and read everything I need to know about webhooks and versioning.
Right.
So it's very much, I think they've made the sort of deeper realms of the Shopify developer documentation a bit more accessible, which I like. So I can literally think about a specific, very granular subject that I'm interested in, like how to preview new features, and I can go to versioning and then previewing new features, and it just dives me straight in. Whereas before, I probably would have had to have read most of the page, most of the guide to have got to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they're sort of bubbling up some of the newer technologies that are at use. Just in the concepts introduction to Shopify, there's a whole section on GraphQL at Shopify,
yeah,
whole section on trust and security and the App Store. So
I should also say that the GraphQL section, though this isn't new, the code snippet windows are new, and so much easier to read the examples, and the running graphical button, amazing. So if you're looking at a guide that has a running graphical button on it, and you've got graphical installed, you can simply click that button and it'll run the example in your test store. So that's a really nice feature. It's not new, but it's just a lot easier to find now.
Yeah, so that's all available now at shopify.dev. I'm assuming old URLs are mapped across. So
I haven't tested that, but yeah, I imagine so.
For those of you who have bookmarks, you may well notice this difference occurring in your browser as you click through to those links that you've saved. But another thing that I noticed, again, there's quite a lot coming on the developer changelog, was the store-specific status is now available.
Yes, that's really good.
Yeah, this, I think, obviously with over 1 million merchants on there, this gives you more opportunity to work out if you have been affected when something bad happens. And so I think that's going to be a really useful thing for people out there who manage stores or working with merchants from the agency side.
I think because Shopify has this podding architecture, so stores are split up into pods, which are all separate versions of Shopify running inside the Shopify infrastructure. Typically what you used to see in the status report was things like some stores are impacted by checkout delay, or some stores have inaccessible admin, and that became quite a frustration, I imagine, for agencies and stuff who are dealing with merchants, being able to give them definitives around whether their store was functioning or not. As well as also being a big support overhead for Shopify.
Absolutely.
It's a big task when something goes down and the phone lines light up. So this just gives you much more granular information. So I can literally log in with my single sign-on and select any one of the stores that are connected to my account and see admin reports, API, everything, broken down with green tick or maintenance or degraded, etc.
So is it fair to say that these are stores that you have direct access to
Yes,
as an admin?
absolutely.
It says here in the news item that the team is currently working on ways to enable partners to see status information for stores whether they have collaboration login access. So I think you will. That's coming, but at
unless
least
it's
the
under
merchant
your
can go in. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, unless it's under your true single sign-on account. So unless you have an actual account on the store itself, you won't be able to see the status right now, is my understanding.
But it looks like that's coming, which I think will be a huge win for people who have collaboration accounts for many merchants. I know, obviously, agencies working with hundreds, if not,
if not thousands,
if not thousands of merchants there. So that'll be really interesting. Finally, something that really piqued my interest was, I don't know if it struck you as a little bit left field, but Shopify quietly released a new app in the App Store, which surprised me for a number of reasons. I thought, or at least the direction of travel was that they weren't doing their own apps anymore. But they've released one called simply Geolocation, which one would assume by its title does what it says on the tin.
Yes.
It's very new. It's got 6 reviews at the time of recording, and the description is boost global sales with language and currency recommendations. And so this feels like a very quick win for people who have multiple currencies enabled. But actually, that's a good point. I wasn't sure whether it would literally just do the switch with the kind of the JSON and put prices into different currencies, or whether this was linked directly to people who have multi-currency enabled on their stores.
No. So this is related to people who have multi-language and multi-currency enabled on their store. So there is a requirement in terms of eligibility of installing it that you must be selling in multiple languages or multiple currencies for Shopify payments.
Right. Okay.
So this is designed to solve a problem where merchants would want to enable multi-currency on their storefront, or they would want to, like I say, enable multi-language, or both. And the issue arose was that it's not a turnkey solution, in that you enable it on the back end and then they go to their storefront and they don't see any difference. And that's because whilst Shopify, exposed really great liquid syntax to allow developers to shortcut a currency selector or a language selector. So they basically just gave us those filters to output the languages into a selector. The average merchant, who maybe they've got an agency, maybe they don't, maybe they're just doing sort of piecemeal gig type work with a freelance developer, they don't necessarily understand that they then have to make their theme multi-currency compatible. So this is really solving that problem, but also the problem of auto selection, right? So some of you may know that when multi-currency first launched, for example, with Plus, they had an automatic geolocation option, which allowed you to just automatically display GBP to people in the UK or USD to people in the US. That wasn't the case for core merchants, for merchants not on Plus. And so this is, again, filling that gap. So this will do the auto selection, and it will also allow you to inject a selector really easily into your theme. That's that's what I've learned so far.
Yeah, I think that's along the lines of what I've read and understood too. It looks ridiculously easy to install, simply an app, and then you can go in and customize to match your brand. There's background text and icon, button background, etc. And you can have it as a bar or a pop-up, actually, and push that to different parts of the page as well.
They call that a welcome mat, don't they? I don't know if Shopify call it that, but I think a lot of merchants call it that, where you land on a store and it says, have we selected the right country for you?
Yes, exactly that. So that was interesting. I'm not sure whether they've rolled their own geo IP lookup or what service they're using in the background, but
well, Shopify was always doing that because it dropped a cookie. So if you looked at the Shopify cookies, there was always a cookie that denoted which country the customer was coming from. Okay. So there was always that geo lookup. It's just, I think, sort of activating that to then make a decision about which currency it displays.
Yeah, interesting to see. But we will keep an eye out on the developer logs and new apps that we think are relevant, and highlight those as we progress through our shows. So, in a change to the previous format of the first few episodes, this week I invited Mr. Michael Shannon of Pixelcabin on for an interview, which you'll hear shortly. And it was really interesting. We delved into a whole bunch of things around Pixelcabin, his background, how he likes to develop, and where he sees things sort of on the API side going. So we'll dive into that, Kieran. I know you've had a chance to listen to it, and then we'll be back to round out the show and pick up some of the points that Michael raised in his interview. So here you are with Michael Shannon from Pixelcabin. I'm delighted to be joined today in the first interview for the Default Podcast with Mr. Michael Shannon of Pixelcabin. Hello, Michael.
Hi, good afternoon.
How are you?
Doing well. It's nice and sunny today in London, so that always helps.
I love the fact that straight to the weather. We are no denying our nationality here. It's I find myself doing that on calls all the time, and then realise how terribly British it is. But where are you? You're actually based in London?
That's right. Yeah, I work from home. We have a remote team, and I'm based here in London.
And so it was funny. Just before we hit record, you're sort of saying how you try to rearrange your office in order to dampen the sort of the sound. And so if we do hear any loud bangs, it could be your rug falling off the wall, but we can cut it out in post for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I've already put the cat outside, so should be uninterrupted.
Excellent. So I was trying to think, Michael, when did we first meet? It was definitely when I was obviously still at Shopify in sort of my partner-facing role. But was it when we were working together on your talk for London's Pursuit in 2018? I have a feeling it was before then.
It was, yeah. I think it was actually, there was an event you ran a few years before that, maybe back in 2014, that was sort of a day looking at Shopify theme development pieces. And I think that was it. It was you'd rented a room somewhere for a day, and you'd gathered a bunch of partners. I think maybe actually that was Gavin Ballard speaking at that event.
Oh, that's right. I remember it well. Yes. And we there was another event in the evening there that we almost missed our own event due to traffic in London. I think we'd all forgotten how bad it was. But that's going back a little bit. But since then we've had the privilege of working on a couple of talks together. The main one, I guess, was the one that you did in Pursuit in London. Over in the East End there in, I guess it was almost a year and a half ago, where you talked a lot about running a remote team. So just in terms of your team, are you still fully remote now, or have you taken the plunge and hired someone local?
So I think it's interesting. We are absolutely still fully remote. And for us, there is less of a difference between remote versus local because of the fact that the entire team is remote. That's sort of a flat layout, even though no one's in the same place. So we're now a team of 8. We're spread across 6 countries, but everyone's in a different place. So in some ways, that actually probably works a little bit easier than if we had a mix of local and remote, because the entire team working that way means that we're all on the same page and on the same level when it comes to communication and tooling and process and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I sort of joked, I think, in the Q&A afterwards that how you would cope if you hired someone else in West London. How would you be on a bound to go for coffees and sort of FaceTime, and how that would change the dynamic? But it's interesting to learn that you're still there. So tell me a little bit about Pixelcabin. What exactly do you do? What kind of projects do you work on? And maybe start at the beginning. How did you get into this Shopify lark?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started Pixelcabin back in 2012. Gregor, other co-founder, and myself. At that point, we were initially focusing on Rails development for startups. But after about a year or so, we started getting more and more interest around e-commerce projects and realized that Shopify was a good platform to invest in from our perspective. Gregor had also had some previous experience with it as well a few years before that with a separate business. So kind of knew how the platform was designed and set up. And from there, we've more recently now started to focus on Shopify Plus focused projects. In the last 4 years or so, that's been the majority of what we've tended to work on. And our core expertise is sort of split between front-end development. So we'll either be heavily modifying a theme that a merchant already has, or building one not quite from scratch. We've got our own framework that we leverage for themes that we build, but very much bespoke to fit the needs of that merchant. And then also bringing in our Rails development process as well. So that's usually focused around building custom apps to serve a specific requirement for that merchant or that project. And that could be something that is focusing on an admin workflow or something that's going to improve the efficiencies of the business, or delivering some additional user-facing functionality that isn't necessarily directly available from the theme side of things. And then we'll build an app that will bridge that gap and surface that on the front end.
That's very interesting. So in terms of the types of projects that you take on, would you say a lot of them as custom apps by the sounds of it, obviously with your Rails background and that kind of thing? Do you find that you get called in by other agencies to help out on particularly sort of big, quote unquote, sticky kind of migration issues? Or what are the kind of sort of projects that you work on?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mix. Quite a few of our projects, so the larger projects that we will take will be a full front end and back end build out. But absolutely, we have had some projects where we've come in to provide back end expertise for an agency that has the theme development really nailed down, but maybe haven't also got back end developers in house, and we'll support from that side of things as well. And that can sometimes be scoping out just a particular feature that the merchant has asked for that needs a bit of extra support from an app to service. So it could be building out, as you say, like a migration piece where we need to build out some middleware to connect their store to an ERP or something else like that. Or maybe something a little bit more specific to that merchant. So maybe some complex search and filter logic that isn't serviced by any of the apps on the App Store. Or we've done some interesting stuff around unique pricing, where each customer sees different prices for those products. As well as a project that we did where we were effectively storing card details into Stripe so that those could be leveraged from a draft order perspective by the merchant and improve the customer experience side of it as well. So a pretty broad range of stuff, to be honest. And yeah, sometimes working with other partners in the ecosystem, and sometimes the project will be something that we have full ownership of.
That's really interesting. See, in terms of your tech stack then, you mentioned Rails. Do you still develop fully in Rails, or...?
Yeah, so all of the app work we do is Rails based, and it's been interesting to see how that has developed particularly over the last 8 years. Because back in sort of the late noughties and into when we started working, Rails was very much kind of still in its big growth spurt. It's very much now kind of hit that sort of maturity level particularly with Rails 5 and now Rails 6. There's a great robustness that really services the kind of apps that we're building well. Plus, we have the benefit that I think the fact that Shopify is still heavily built on top of Rails means that they have a lot of internal expertise. And so the first-party libraries that Shopify offers to interact with the platform are quite well supported when it comes to the Rails versions of those.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you actually how, obviously, Shopify, they're born and bred as a Rails app, and wonder whether there was much of a benefit of picking Rails as your kind of your platform of choice and then interacting with Shopify as a result of that. Do they a lot of the gems are they maintained by Shopify staff or in relation to the platform, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. I remember seeing at I think it was maybe the last San Francisco Unite, they had some stats up that were showing the different languages used by app developers, and Rails wasn't actually sort of the significant majority that I was expecting. I think it was maybe at that point something like 40-something% of apps were built in Rails. So the platform is in many ways language and framework agnostic. If you're building an app to work with it, there's nothing that means you have to write it in Rails. But from the libraries they provide, yeah, there's both the Shopify API gem and the Shopify app gem that we use in all our projects. We actually have an additional gem that we've written internally that wraps those and adds some additional functionality that we are always reaching for in every app, and that just streamlines things a bit from our perspective. But it's very much leveraging what those two apps provide. And I think particularly with the efforts over the last year to roll out API versioning on the platform, it seems like there's been a good amount of attention from Shopify as well on keeping those gems up to date, even going as far as the most recent cookie-based issue that was hitting with Chrome 80. There was an update to the Shopify app gem that effectively, as long as you got your apps up to date with using that version, solved the problem. So there are definitely some nice benefits to being able to use that as a foundation, and it does a lot of the stuff that every single app needs, registering webhooks and the OAuth flow and all this kind of stuff. So it means that we can really then focus on the functionality that's unique to that merchant.
Yeah, I think just if I recall correctly, I think PHP was shockingly, although it seemed at the time, in the lead in terms of languages used. But I'll stand corrected on that. So when you're spinning up an app, how kind of like, it sounds like you've got a sort of frameworks in place. How long would it take you to get to the point of having a sort of ready to roll application where you can just start working on features? It sounds like you've really streamlined that process.
Yeah, we've done quite a lot to try and focus on that. I think in focusing on that in the last year, it's also been the point where quite a few things have been changing with the Shopify platform. So it sort of lined up quite well that as we were trying to streamline that, there were areas around Shopify that were starting to shift as well around the way the APIs work too. It's funny, like how long does it take to start up an app? We don't have a sort of a best time currently running. And it does
That's
still
a bit
vary.
Silly question in a way, but I think
time to first
like,
app.
Yeah, it's time to first app. I mean, it feels like, it's obviously not. It's more than a single line of terminal bashed out, but it feels like you. I guess what I'm saying is you've invested in the foundations that allow you to kind of develop in a streamlined, quote unquote rapid fashion. Is that fair?
I mean, broadly speaking, from the way that our Rails apps work is we have a generator that sits on top of, or a template that sits on top of the Rails new command. And so that bootstraps a lot of our stuff into it, and then it pulls in the gem that we have. So it's kind of the same speed as just starting up a regular Rails app. What it's then doing, though, is a lot of the methods that, or particularly around the shop model, where there's often a lot of stuff that you want to be able to do and interact with when it comes to a shop. It's helped streamline things where we've abstracted all of that out to a gem. So if we need to iterate on it, particularly as the API changes, for example, the way that pagination changed last year, it was great that we could update our gem that wrapped around pagination requests, and then we didn't need to go through and make that same change over and over in every single app that we had using the gem.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And you talked about APIs there, and obviously APIs in Shopify land have gone under kind of, a huge change in the last sort of year, 18 months with API versioning. How do you guys manage that? How have you been dealing with that, and how is that affecting your thinking of what your apps are going to look like as the API changes?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, and I think this applies to quite a few areas of the platform, how, as you say, the last 12, 18 months, we've started to see some bigger changes in the architectural decisions and the way that changes are pulling through, and whether that be from the order editing perspective, or the fact that now with API versioning, it's going to probably allow the various product teams to actually implement features and functionality that previously would have just been too breaking to be able to effectively roll out. From our perspective, I think April this year is going to be interesting from the app community side of things, because it'll be the first point where there is a deprecation of supported APIs, I think probably since Shopify started. I know there have been some informal pieces probably along the way where there's been a warning about some change, but with the 12-month support window, this is going to be the first time where we see that actually come into play in a more structured fashion. From our perspective, we've put in process effectively every quarter, every time there's a new release, we have scheduled a review session where we go through the release notes, see what's changed, and that's both the dev team, but also looking at it from a product perspective, like what does this mean for the next time we're pitching on a project, or we've just been talking to a client recently about something they want to do. Does this impact? Is there something new we can now do that we couldn't do before? So looking at it sort of very holistically, and then working that through from our internal gem, and then through to how that might impact on the apps that we have. It also kind of changes the conversations we're then going to have with our clients, because if we've built an app for a merchant, we usually have some kind of support agreement with them, but sometimes that can be as simple as, if there are required upgrades, we'll do them as or when. I think this is going to help a little bit with that as well, because we can give the merchants a little bit more predictability about what that rhythm is normally going to look like, and help them understand what that cost is going forwards as well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, order editing is obviously one of the most, I guess, one of the biggest changes that will impact app developers. But I'd like to turn our attention a little bit to the front end, because you guys have obviously done a lot of work on the front end. And at Unite last year, you gave a talk all about sort of front end testing and CI and all this kind of stuff that went over my head. But I have subsequently read up on and found fascinating. But what do you make of the recent changes to themes? As someone who kind of cut their teeth in Shopify on themes, it feels like not a breaking change, a making change, if you like. It's changed the ballpark in terms of themes. How are you at Pixelcabin embracing these potential opportunities offered up by the new sort of theme framework?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because with sections, when that came out a few years ago, that in itself was a big shift, because it was starting to give much more flexibility to the merchant. And it in many ways, it made themes bought, just when you buy a theme and install it, more flexible as well. So I'm sure it added value from that side of things, but it also gave us the ability to still build a very tailored theme, and then potentially build custom sections that were tailored to that. So the fact that's going to roll out to the rest of the theme structure is really exciting. And I know that for a while it was sort of sections everywhere was sort of the way that it was talked about. I know that now it's being branded a little bit differently. But as you say, it's actually a much more significant change from under the hood, and the way that the themes are now going to be structured. And in many ways, just it's more of a paradigm shift than it is just a new module that you can throw in there. Particularly when you look at the way that the content is associated with the theme. So we've often done things where we've put a lot of configuration in the theme settings, and that's been really helpful, particularly when we've been building a theme to be deployed to multiple stores, which is a fairly common approach with Plus setups, where we'll build a single theme for that business, but then a lot of the regional variances will be controlled by the theme settings, sort of like environment variables. So the fact that there's now going to be the ability to store a lot more data on all of the different resource types in a shop. You can, either on all products, they can have data attached to them that doesn't live in the theme code, or just saying that one product specifically has a different product template layout. And that can all be controlled through the new Sections API it's to be honest, it's such a big change, and the fact that we're still in early preview makes it a little bit hard almost to really see how all these pieces are going to fit together. We've already been sort of looking at this from a design perspective as well, and thinking about, because we have an in-house designer that works closely with our front end team, and looking at how can we explore the flexibility that this provides. But it's probably going to have an impact as well on our dev tooling workflow as well. This is going to be a long answer possibly to your question, but I know you mentioned the front end testing and sort of what we put together around that, and the talk I gave last summer. And one of the challenges around, there are a few challenges around testing on Shopify. It's always the case when you're trying to build automated testing around a hosted platform, that you can't quite as easily put the code you want to test in a box and then run it in a virtual machine. And that was part of what I was looking to address with our test suite, was how could we use something like Cypress with Shopify and spin up themes just for testing and then tear them down afterwards. But I think the fact that so much more of the theme is now going to be dynamically controlled by data that doesn't live in the theme itself is going to have an impact on that. It may mean that we've got the flexibility that actually from our test suite, we can put a theme up there and then through the Sections API, push and pull different elements onto the page and test them. It may mean that actually we can do more focused testing on just specific elements in a way that's sometimes a little bit difficult to do right now, because if you build a section and currently the way that section data is stored, it's hard to test what happens if the section is configured a few different ways. Maybe you have a section that's going to put a product grid on the page. You want to maybe check that works well when it's 2 columns as much as it is with 6 columns, if that's the options that you're giving. And that's a little bit hard to validate right now, but potentially through this new approach, it may be possible for us to test more variations of those more thoroughly. There's a lot here, and it feels like we've kind of only really just started to scratch the surface. I think particularly once the developer previews opened up to cover more resource types as well, when we can look at how this works for blogs and articles as well as collections. I think it's going to be it's very exciting to see where it's going for sure.
Do you think you'll make use of the, now forgive me if I've got the terminology wrong, the kind of app extensions in the themes where you can kind of drag on sections for different apps? How do you think that will affect things?
So this was actually one of the first things I started digging into, because given the fact that we build custom apps, I was curious to see how this might change our deploy workflow. If we're wanting to build sections of a theme that maybe are deployed not through our current theme deployment process, but maybe through some other workflow. And then there's also the other challenge, which is it potentially improves the experience of adding sections or snippets from apps. So many apps will need to have code loaded into the theme for them to work. And the current approach for that is often a little bit challenging, where either it's a manual guide that you follow as a developer, or maybe you give access to the app developers and they modify your theme, or maybe they inject something directly. But that getting all of that back into our GitHub repository of the theme can sometimes be it has to be quite a managed process, and then handling updates can again be a little bit challenging around that. So I think there's definitely some opportunity that it might reduce some of the disruption around that. It might though also mean that we lose a bit of flexibility about how we can modify that code that's injected. I'm going to be really curious to see how that plays out in practice. But if we, for example, want to restyle a reviews widget that's come from a reviews app, is that still going to be straightforward for us to do, or is that maybe going to have changed a bit? I'm still curious to learn more about exactly how, as an app developer, you can manage the code that gets loaded through that. Because from what I've seen so far, that is mostly managed through the partner dashboard, which is that's where a lot of the app configuration currently lives. But if we were to build an app where there was a close relationship between the functionality that the app was delivering and this app section that needed to be loaded into the theme, it definitely could potentially be challenging if we have to manage a deploy process where we push out the new code on the app and then have to go and log into the partner dashboard and update the code in there as well. And how does that process work? And are there ways to preview those changes? So I think I'm definitely keen to see more information as there is more produced about how that workflow can be managed effectively from a developer perspective.
No, I agree. I think you touched on some interesting points there around kind of content moving, outside the theme, living outside the theme and moving with the store. I think that opens up a lot of interesting possibilities. But as you say, I think there are still a bunch of kind of TBC outcomes here in terms of some of the code injection. I was reading the other day that I believe they've got some new sort of endpoints that allow you to tidy up some of the injected code that as well.
Really?
But, which I'll put in the show notes. But again, it was I'd have to read up on it again to even quote with anything approaching mild authority on how it happens. But I think, as I said, as you said and I said, I think it is a sea change in terms of how these themes are constructed. Do you? It sounds like you see it as a big opportunity. Do you think anyone in the ecosystem should be worried that sort of custom theme development might be a thing of the past as more sort of themes through the theme store offer yet more functionality?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it's something that we were thinking about as well when the initial sections were rolled out as well. As you provide more flexibility, does that reduce the opportunity for custom theme work? I think, to be honest, that really comes back to maybe one of the persistent misunderstandings of Shopify as a flexible platform for front-end development. And I think sometimes, potentially, if you've looked at the platform mostly as a place that you would buy a template and use that template, you might have the impression that you're really working with a templated environment, and therefore you're going to be limited to what Shopify templates can do. And that's never really been the case. And I don't think that really is, even as these templates or as these themes become more flexible and more powerful, that won't negate the need for really custom experiences, because at the end of the day, brands are going to want to have something that really feels like it is a representation of who they are. It's one of the big sort of shifts in commerce in general, is that as more and more brands move from having a high street presence to being online only, that doesn't negate the need for, as a customer, for you to feel like you are entering an experience that is representing the brand that you're looking to buy, and how you bring the customer on that journey and how you communicate what your product is as important as ever. So I don't think it's really going to change that, because there is still going to be the need to build those very integrated experiences. It might change some of the threshold at which that choice makes sense. And I think that's always the case, even just as new apps are coming out, is, you get a certain amount of value for using an app or for buying a theme. And so how much more value you're getting for doing something a little bit different. But I think, to be honest, as the platform continues to grow, and we're still in many ways in the early days of some of the larger, more established brands looking at Shopify as a platform, it's just going to, I think, open up more opportunity to give them the flexibility they need, even if it's in a custom theme. Because if we build something custom that really fits with that brand experience, but still gives them the flexibility to modify the content very dynamically as they are trying to adjust what they're trying to say online, if they don't need to bring us in just to make content changes, that's generally a better use of our time and their money to focus us on adding that custom functionality.
No, I agree 100%, and I think it might have actually been yourself at a debrief event that we were at last year, where you kind of hosted one of the panels, where Nick from Shogun, which is obviously a tool that allows this kind of custom sort of page building sort of framework. How do you feel about these new announcements? Do you feel challenged? And he was all for it, and I think it's a very refreshing take that the more access Shopify gives to something like Shogun or to a custom front end theme, the better it's going to be, the more opportunity it creates. And I think that's probably the best way of looking at it. But what you said there really struck. The amount of people over the years that have said, "Oh, it's just templates, right? You can't do X, you can't do Y." I'm like, it's HTML, CSS, JavaScript at the end of the day, with some kind of some path routes, as it were, URLs that give you access to certain data, but you can pretty much do whatever you want. Right. So I think, it'll be really interesting to see how that goes. I do think it's the shift in the kind of theme structures is going to take a little bit of getting into. There's a lot of new concepts in there, and I think you'll be able, from my understanding at least, to sort of mix the metaphors between sort of master pages and theme templates for, going forward for a little bit as well. So it'll be interesting to see what, if we have this conversation again in a year, which I hope we will, how you've embraced that, or what problems or new opportunities have been given to you because of the new changes to the themes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, following on from that point that you were referring to that Nick made, I think that's what, a lot of the companies in this space have really tried to build their business on. It definitely goes for us, is that at the end of the day, this is a platform that handles the e-commerce engine part of what you're trying to achieve, but you build whatever you want on top of that. And the theme structure and Liquid, it gives you a good foundation. You can completely depart from that and build something completely separate from Shopify now, using the storefront API that's definitely seems to have matured a lot now recently as well. You can use apps to add, something specific that just isn't catered for in the core offering of the platform. It's definitely something that I feel like there is the opportunity to keep busting that myth a bit. And that's part of the communication that we're often doing when we're talking to new clients about what we would offer them.
Do you find that you even clients who are maybe have been in and around e-commerce a long time still have these preconceptions, or has a lot of the kind of growth and bigger brands moving on to Shopify kind of helped you, use it in air quotes, sell the platform as a solution?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think often the kind of clients that we're talking to these days have probably progressed a little bit beyond that point. I think I often see, I think conversations on Twitter and other areas where you see that slight misunderstanding persisting. I think by the time that we're often talking to potential merchants, they've already understood our offering, at least at a high level, to understand that we're going to combine Shopify and our development to deliver what they're looking for. I think it sometimes does still kick in, though, in a few areas where Shopify has a different approach to other similar platforms. And there are still some challenges that aren't fully solved, for sure, when it comes to offering solutions on Shopify. I think multi-currency is something that there are a few approaches that you can take. Some serve some merchants better than others. They're a little bit different to what another platform might take as its approach. But it's always the trade-off. If you're comparing a Shopify build and first-year costs versus something like Magento, you're looking at very different cost offerings as well. And so then there's the question of, well, what makes sense holistically for what you're trying to achieve with your project?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, lots to think about in terms of apps and APIs and themes, and I'm sure we'll get you back on at some point and see how Pixelcabin's progressing with those changes. I'd like to round out by sort of waving your magic wand and then asking for some predictions, or maybe not predictions, or things that you'd like to see announced at Unite 2020 this year. I think you've been to most of them, if not all, and you've been there for some of the. So some years you'll testify have kind of far-reaching impact in terms of the announcements. Others, long-awaited changes to the platform. What do you see happening this year? Stick your neck out and give us a couple of predictions.
Well, I have no inside info on this, so this is very much almost a wish list in a way.
Go for it.
But I wouldn't be surprised if I think if you look at the release cycle of other platforms, whether that be something like Android or other sort of significant platforms now that are dealing with major version updates, which is in some ways what Unite is kind of being, even though there isn't obviously a versioning with Shopify. It's not like we're on version 10 or something. But last year felt like a big year addressing some sort of big changes in almost the architectural decisions that were happening internally. Things that had previously always been considered as very difficult to address based on the way that the platform is structured, order editing being an obvious thing that will have had far-reaching impacts. And you can kind of see how that built on smaller but still significant announcements from previous years. The way that inventory management was really broken out into its own thing would have no doubt paved the way to start to open up the flexibility around order editing. And then all of these changes to the way that themes are structured, which, given that we're really going to have, you're right in that there will be a blending of master pages versus some of the more, typical ways that themes are built. But I think it is going to be a bit of a before and after moment, in that there will be themes that have been built before and will follow the approach that we're all used to today. And there will be themes that adopt that very fully. And then that will be the way that they will be moving forwards. So I wouldn't be surprised if this year we maybe see more of a consolidation, or maybe that's me thinking about the kind of things I would like to see. I think there are some pain points that unnatural as part of the growth that would be great to see addressed. The API versioning is a big improvement in many ways, but there are still some areas around that aren't always the easiest for us to work with. The fact, for example, that while in your app code you can specify that you want to start using 2020-01 or whatever the version might be, but you also need to remember in your partner dashboard to update the webhook version, and you can't do that till after you've deployed your code. And then what happens to the webhooks that ran in between that period? There's definitely some areas around that. So I think it's a fairly boring request in some ways, but API access to the partner dashboard, or looking at ways that there would be more opportunities for apps to adopt a sort of configuration as code approach.
Right, yeah.
We have that with some things. If you look at the way that as an app you can register webhooks, you can fully automate that, so that if you deploy a new version that needs a new webhook, as you deploy, you can also register the webhook and you don't need to do anything. So having some more opportunities around that would definitely be very exciting, because they would, I think, as we further increase the complexity of what apps and themes can do, both separately and together, thinking of the app sections we talked of earlier, looking at ways to streamline the developer workflows around that would be fantastic.
Excellent. Well, we'll get you back on, and we'll see how far those wishes have been answered or not, and maybe there's some other announcements there that have piqued your interest as well. But
yes,
just say thank you so much for joining us as our first interviewee on the Default Podcast. We'll obviously
to be the inaugural guest on this, and thanks for the conversation as always. Really interesting to talk.
Absolutely agree. Where can people find out more about Pixelcabin, the work that you do, and where are you on the social media?
Absolutely. You can check out our website, which is pixelcabin.io. and Twitter, we're just at Pixelcabin, which is nice and easy. Same handle on Instagram as well. So yeah, please do check us out. And if anyone has any follow-up questions or thoughts on some of the stuff we've been talking about today, it's one of the things I really enjoy about this community is there's a lot of engagement around some of these changes and what everyone's trying to do. So please do reach out. I'd love to continue the conversation there as well.
Brilliant. And we'll see you at Unite.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. Brilliant. Thanks for your time, Michael. Cheers.
Thanks very much.
So there we go. That was Michael Shannon from Pixelcabin. It was nice to sort of try and get the old interview boots back on. I apologise if it's a little rusty in parts, but it seemed to go pretty well. And yeah, Michael had plenty to say.
Yeah, it was great. It's really interesting stuff from Michael, particularly stuff around versioning and the partner dash stuff was particularly interesting.
Yeah, well, you're someone who's very au fait with versioning, sort of something you've spent a lot of time sort of explaining and thinking through. What's your take on what Michael had to say?
Yeah, I think, it wasn't as much the versioning stuff that was fascinating to me as much as it was he sort of branched off the versioning stuff into some of the consequences of versioning, and that's really where my interest lie as well. And it's around the areas where Shopify have used the partner dash to fill a gap where there's maybe some configuration that needs to happen. So a good example is when you have an application using a particular version of the API and it needs to use the same version of the webhooks. And that configuration for which version the webhooks use is set in, in the partner dash. And one of the challenges, I guess, that versioning has presented, as Michael was explaining, was that you effectively have to deploy your application and then rush to the partner dash and change the version of the webhook you're using. And that's going to apply to more and more things, I think. And it brings up a good point around, configuration as code and how Shopify can do more around kind of making this stuff programmatically accessible.
Yeah, so I guess in an ideal world, you'd be deploying that new code and programmatically be assigning that to the relevant version and webhook. But at the moment, there's the manual interjection that has to happen. So whilst you could argue that the disruption might be minimal, that's certainly not going to be the case with apps that have tens of thousands of users. There could be quite an impact. And I think Michael was sort of saying that, his way of thinking was you basically take the app offline, which isn't good, a functioning app to take it offline and then deploy. It reminds me of those Apple days when it's like there was a new release coming and they'd literally close the store for 2 days. Do you remember?
Yes, yeah. I think some of that was for media attention, but yeah, I think the case of having to affect, I think that is worst case scenario, having to take your app offline. But it really depends, as you were saying, how many orders your merchants have. For example, if you're listening to the orders webhook, order create webhook, you could be receiving thousands, or if not tens of thousands of those in an hour. And it's how do you recover from a situation where you've switched versions? So I think some work around the kind of I guess I would call them developer APIs or platform APIs would be really great to see.
Yeah, I think and maybe some more kind of defensive programming in a sense of like, if we know this is the case, how do we then go and check that we have got everything, all of those orders are where they should be and stuff like that. So maybe
yeah, absolutely. So app developers can definitely check with the header that comes back, the API version header that comes back from Shopify. So they can say, well, the new version of the app is using this, and we received this back from the old version of the API, and then we can obviously handle that in a specific way. It shouldn't be the case that you're ever just getting, for example, a missing field or a field name change or something, because you should be looking for those headers and taking action accordingly.
Yeah, Michael, very smart guy. Pixelcabin, I know you've worked with them on some launches in the past, doing some very very interesting things, pushing the boundaries there. Yeah. And I'll put it in the show notes, and I think we referred to it in the interview, the talk that Michael himself gave at Unite 2019, which was kind of about front-end testing. So he's definitely got
that was my highlight of Unite, actually, I think.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah,
very, very good. And I know that prompted a lot of conversation, and I'm sure he had some interesting chats with other devs after that. But yeah, thanks, Michael, for joining us. We look forward to catching up with you again on a future podcast. But yeah, just to round out, this will be going out in the week of Shopify Pursuit in Amsterdam. We're both going to be there. Kieran will be resplendent in his branded default swag. I believe, although you are the holder of all of the swag, I've not yet to see it in person.
Yeah, I'm
but
the keeper of all swag.
There will be some giveaways if anyone is interested. If you actually listen to this podcast and would like a t-shirt, we'll be bringing a handful, and I'll carry on. So come and tap us up, and we will happily or give you one. All we ask is that maybe you could share a photo of yourself resplendent in our default swag for the Instas. Talking of which, final note, I have descended into one of those people who posts a picture of their pet on Instagram. Kieran, I do apologize. This was not discussed
that was really on brand, wasn't it?
In our stand-up that obviously we don't have. But last podcast, Holly, my cat, who's very vocal. I've had cats in the past, but never quite as meowy as Holes.
She's pretty shouty.
Pretty shouty. Decided to wake up from her slumber midway through and demand attention. So we managed to cut most of that out, but it's just there as a stark reminder that you should never work with developers and animals. So anyways, talking of Insta, yeah, that count's grown as well. So please do follow
it.
us.
Nice.
Yes. Yeah. We posted some code on there recently, although, we maybe do more of that as time goes on. But anyways, thank you as always for listening. This was episode 3 of the Default Podcast. You can subscribe in all of the places that you would normally find your podcasts. And we will look forward to more chat, more news, more interviews in episode 4 coming in a couple of weeks. Thanks for listening.
Cheers.